Number 1.
When I was 7 years old, something happened while my family was visiting my grandmother in North Carolina, and to this day we still have no answers as to how or why this event occurred. Recounting this event to other people is very difficult for us, because unless you were there to witness it, it's going to come across as impossible, and we've grown really tired of people looking at us like we're crazy. At the time, my brother was 10, my mom was in her early 40s, and my grandmother was in her 60s. None of us were drunk. There wasn't a gas leak or anything in the water making us hallucinate, so try to have an open mind. My grandmother lived on a very isolated country road in North Carolina that was actually named after her family, because for the past several generations our extended maternal side of the family had populated the area and collectively owned about 1,000 acres. The closest neighbor was my mother's cousin, who lived just outside of screaming distance. The morning in question, it was very early, probably around 7 a.m. or just before, and my brother and I were eating cereal in the kitchen while my mother and grandmother were in the other room. From outside we suddenly heard a sound of a truck pulling up, and we leave the table and run to the big window out front. There was a very old-fashioned pickup truck outside, circa 1930s perhaps, and it seemed like the only thing holding it together was rust. Despite how frail it looked, the engine was idling, but there was no one behind the wheel. My mom and grandmother take a look out the window, and we ask them if they knew who it was. My grandmother didn't have a clue, and muttered that maybe it was a farmhand who had gotten lost. She left the window and picked up the phone to call her nephew, our mother's cousin, to drive over just in case. My brother and I were babbling non-stop about the weird truck outside, as all kids do in mysterious situations. We found it more exciting and weird than anything else. But looking back, I remember my mom was very quiet and was likely trying not to let on how concerned she was. My grandmother put down the phone and reported that the line had gone dead halfway through the call. That was unsettling. Before we could even process the phone situation, there was an incredibly loud, insistent banging on the front door. The kind of banging where you're throwing your weight against a locked door while you're trying to escape from a burning building. We all scream in shock and sudden terror, and my grandmother, still able to think clearly, huddled us all into the living room, away from the large window and the front door, and grabbed a serrated bread knife from the kitchen. The banging stopped after maybe a minute, and my grandmother walked over to a smaller window and peeked outside. She scanned the entire front lawn, and we could hear her whisper that no one was out there. We barely had time to take a breath when we heard banging from every door in the house. I can still hear it echoing in my head to this day. All 3 doors on the ground floor sounded like they were being assaulted, and what made it worse was that it was almost rhythmic, like all the doors were being struck at a pattern and not at random. The doors were all sturdy and thick, but the house was very old, and even in my tiny 7-year-old head, I knew it was only a matter of time before the hinges broke, or one of the doors cracked just enough for someone to reach in and turn the knob. Down in the basement there was a storm door that was boarded up with plywood, and I even remember hearing echoes of that barricade being kicked and stomped upon. The entire time this was happening, we were all huddled in the living room, behind the couch, but none of us ever once caught a glimpse of anyone circling the house out of any of the windows. After what felt like 10 minutes, but was probably closer to 3, the banging finally stopped, and we heard the sound of another truck coming up the driveway. My mom shouted that it was her cousin, and we all breathed a sigh of relief. Looking back, I'm kinda surprised that Mom allowed us to leave the cover of the couch, and saw her cousin coming up the driveway with a shotgun in his hand. He pauses when he reaches the old idling truck and peers inside the cab to examine it. After a moment, he quickly starts moving towards the house, a look of concern bordering on fear on his face. My grandmother unlocked the door for him, and he entered the house quickly and slammed the door. I remember this next part the most clearly. Mom's cousin had just opened his mouth and asked, "Is everybody okay?" when the door he had just locked behind him practically cracked down the center from a massive blow that struck it from the outside. My brother and I literally crouched there in the entryway and started screaming with our hands over our ears. and my mom practically had to drag us to the other room because we were too scared to move. Every door around the house was being assaulted again, and we heard one of the windows shatter. My mom was holding us tightly and my grandmother started praying aloud. My mother's cousin cocked the shotgun and yelled for all of us to stay down, and with more guts than brains, he threw open the front door and fired a shot outside. The banging immediately stopped. We heard him fire a second shot, and then a third, and we heard glass shattering and a loud crunch. We again abandoned our position behind the couch and ran to the front door. The old truck had tried to peel out backwards and slammed into our cousin's truck. He had blown out the passenger side window, and as he left the porch and raised the shotgun again, the truck floored it off the driveway, up onto the grass, and around our cousin's truck. It then crossed the lawn towards the road. The shotgun went off a fourth time and blew out the back window, and I remember having a clear view of the steering wheel. There was no one in the cab. My mom's cousin booked it to his own truck with the intention of following them, but Mom and Grandma screamed at him to stay put since the phone line had been cut, and we couldn't call the police until about an hour or so later, when we all gathered the courage to pile into our cousin's truck and drive to his place. I know it's hard to imagine a time without cell phones. The police drove out to our grandmother's property and examined the damage done to all of the doors. There was even a fist-sized hole in the plywood that was covering the basement door. The police made a note of the old truck's tire marks and the damage done to our cousin's truck, but despite all that, there was not a single boot print in the entire yard. Our cousin reported that there had been no license plate on the truck, but when he looked into the cab, he noticed that there were all kinds of weird restraints, handcuffs, C-clamps, nylon straps, and he said that the floor looked like it was covered in dried blood, and the whole truck had smelled like a deer carcass left in the heat. The police interviewed all of us individually, and I remember feeling so stupid and afraid to tell the officer that there hadn't been anyone driving the truck, but that's what we saw. And as honest Christians, that's what we reported, and nothing ever became of the police investigation. The phone line and the doors were all fixed, and we all moved on with our lives. My grandmother and cousin have since passed away, but they never changed their account of what happened. My brother, mother, and I since stopped trying to figure it out, and we don't talk about it much anymore. After the police left our cousin to pick up a few pieces of broken glass from the old truck he found in the lawn, he kept them, and eventually passed them on to me. I keep them in an old sunglasses case in my safe, and every once in a while I pour myself a drink and take them out and examine them. And I just wonder where the hell they came from. Number 2. For reference, I'm a 29-year-old male, but I first remember hearing the voices when I was 15. I don't mean started hearing them inside my head. I'm not schizophrenic. I hear voices from beneath the ground. I used to live out in rural Missouri. In our backyard among the trees, right before our property line ended, was a stone well. When I used to play outside as a child, my parents would constantly have to chase after me because I would make a beeline directly for the well. I used to claim that I heard people talking down there. I don't recall any of that, but I believe them. One day when I was 15, I was out in the backyard mowing the lawn. I heard what sounded like the echoing sounds of screaming coming from the woods. I cautiously moved through the trees until I found the well, which seemed to be the source of the noise. I had forgotten it was even there, because it was barely visible among the shadows of overhanging limbs. I peered down into the stone pit, but I only saw the pitch darkness below. But from somewhere deep within it, there came horrific, tormented screams. It sounded like there were dozens of them, and they were all wailing like they were having their skin peeled off and their feet held in fire. I remember peering deep down into the well, convinced there had to be a radio or something down there, when something terrifying happened that stopped my heart. One of the voices called out my name. I leapt back from the well in shock and bolted out of the woods, sprinting all the way back to the house. My older brother was in the garage, and I ran to him, frantically grabbing his arm and shrieking that there were people in the well in the backyard. I remember he started cursing at me angrily and told me to stop acting like such a bitch, but regardless of his frustration, he walked out back with me so I could prove it to him. Once we got to the well, the screaming had intensified and I kept my distance, but my brother walked right up to it and peered in, even spitting down into it. "Well, where's the screaming?" I just stared at him, feelings of confusion, horror, and betrayal all exploding within me. The noise from down in the well was so loud and clear, it was making my skin crawl. But my brother was just looking at me annoyed and completely unbothered. I was convinced he was just messing with me and ignoring the screams just to make me feel paranoid. When suddenly a woman's blood-curdling scream echoed from down below. It was so loud that I actually winced and stumbled backwards and fell to my knees. My brother, who had one of his feet up on the stone edge, didn't even flinch, and he looked at me like I was losing it. I ran back to the house and refused to go anywhere near the well for several months. But I was never able to get the memories of the screaming out of my head, and I lost quite a bit of sleep over it. My brother and I were never exactly best friends, so he did bully me every so often, but he was too lazy to even flush the toilet half the time, so the idea that he may have gone through all this trouble to pull such an elaborate prank really bothered me. If it really was just a radio or recording down there, how could he have known that I would hear my name called up to me from below at that exact moment? And how could he have acted so damn calm like he didn't hear anything? I began to fear like I was losing my mind. A few months later, I recovered enough of my courage to visit the well again. I took my cousin and her Australian Shepherd Molly into the woods without telling them anything about the well, and within 20 steps I could already hear the wailing. But Molly didn't so much as growl as we approached it, and my cousin even did a quick dancer on the edge of the stone before she left off and kept walking. All the while the voices down below were screaming for mercy. I told my cousin some excuse about needing to leave and ran back to the house, and I'm not ashamed to admit it. I locked myself inside my bedroom closet and cried for over an hour. A week or so later, I returned to the well alone with one of those old-fashioned cassette audio recorders and left it running perched on the edge of the stone. I hid behind a nearby tree, covering my ears in terror, as at least 3 different voices called out my name and begged for the torture to stop. When I returned to the house after recording the screams for about 15 minutes, I rewound the tape and played it back in my bedroom, and all I heard was the soft sounds of the forest. Convinced I was crazy, I vowed never to return to the well, and I kept that promise for 7 years until I was 22. By that time, I was no longer living in the house, but I returned to feed my mom's cat and water her plants while she was on vacation. Out of pure morbid curiosity, I walked out across the backyard and returned to the well. The voices were still wailing. I only stood there for about a minute, but I heard very clearly one of the voices call out my name, along with the phrase, "I hung for days, no one came." As I began to make my way back to the house, I heard the voice cry out one final statement, "She killed your sister." When my mother came home that night, I was sitting in the kitchen. I asked her about my great-uncle, her father's brother, who had killed himself when I was 4. I asked her how he died. She was taken aback by my question, but responded simply that he had hung himself in his tool shed with an extension cord. When I asked her how long it took for someone to discover his body, she gave me a concerned look and said that he had been dead for at least 4 days when they found him. I didn't flinch when I asked her the next question. "Mom, did I ever have a sister?" My mother stared back at me in shock and anger and asked me why I would ask such a thing. But I persisted until she admitted that between me and my older brother, she had terminated a pregnancy when my brother was a year old because she wasn't ready for another child. After that night, I visited the well only once more. It was about a year later when my mom was in the process of selling the house. I sealed it with a plywood cover. As I was doing this, the voices bellowed out to me that I would soon be joining them, and that my daughter would be raped at 18. At the time, I wasn't even dating anyone. But today, as I write this, I'm married with a 3-month-old daughter. I don't expect anyone to believe this, call me a liar or crazy. That's fine. But the only time I ever heard those voices screaming at me has been in that exact spot. I would be happy to take you out to that lonely patch of woods in Missouri, but you likely wouldn't hear anything anyway. I don't believe in heaven or hell, or at least, I didn't used to. And I have never come up with any other explanation as to what I heard from down in that pit. If there is a hell, maybe it's closer than we all think.
There's always a reason to be afraid.